Our third speaker is having a homecoming. Jeremy Walton graduated from this fine university and is now an assistant professor and faculty fellow at the New York University Program for Religious Studies.
Thank you. It's both humbling and harrowing to follow two such elegant and eloquent speakers, especially one of whom was only speaking as a proxy. So thank you again for that. I'll begin by begging both your forbearance and forgiveness. Like Professor Sara Toprak yesterday, I have written a much longer paper than will fit in 20 minutes, and I know we have a very severe disciplinarian chair, so I'll try to be brief. I hadn't even decided before sitting down up here whether I was going to read from the paper or just summarize in broad strokes. I'm going to try to do a little bit of both. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I'm a little bit taller than the microphone enjoys. So by way of an introduction, I just want to contextualize this paper within my broader project. On the one hand, as an anthropologist, and as Professor Simpson just said, I did finish my degree here in anthropology about a year ago, and this is my first time back, so it is a very uniquely special occasion for me. As an anthropologist, I don't so much have the focus on the broad scope and global horizons of the Hizmet movement like so many do. Rather, I focus more on its particular contextual realization within Turkey and indeed within the city of Istanbul especially. On the other hand, unlike many, indeed most of our speakers here this weekend, all of whom have been just wonderful, I don't focus solely on the Gülen movement. Rather, I focus on civil Islamic institutions in contemporary Turkey generally, among them institutions affiliated with the Gülen movement, particularly Gazeteciler ve Yazarlar Vakfı, but also Nur institutions, those that are supporting the Risale Nur and the figure of Said Nursi, and also interestingly, Alevi institutions, and we can talk a bit more about that in the question and answer period if you like. So that's just to contextualize what I'm doing. I will read a bit and hopefully it'll go quickly because I know you're all very hungry, as am I. So this conference does provide a unique event for me as a homecoming, but it in itself is not entirely unique. As many other presenters have already had occasion to reflect upon, there's been an exceptional groundswell in academic interest in Fethullah Gülen and the Gülen movements that recent years have witnessed. To some degree, of course, this groundswell is a testament to the extraordinary labors of Gülen institutions themselves and their overarching interest in fostering academic production. In my mind, a rather unique characteristic of the Gülen movement that demands a more thorough analysis and attention. On the whole, the emerging literature on both the works of Fethullah Gülen and the Gülen movement, which we should note spans the academic and non-academic divide, can be divided into two broad categories. On the one hand, we might list works that focus broadly on the theological bases and ethical aspirations of Gülen's oeuvre and the Gülen movement. Works in this vein, including much of Gülen's own writing, tend to emphasize questions of interreligious dialogue, Gülen's relationship to strands and concepts in Islamic theology such as Sufism, and other broadly theological and ethical questions. On the other hand, a second category of literature pays specific attention to the sociological formations and political implications of the Gülen movement. I'm thinking here much of Hakan Yavuz's work, also Bernard Turum's Between Islam and the State. Undoubtedly, each of these two sets of literature about Gülen and the Hizmet movement have made crucial contributions to a more thorough understanding of contemporary Islam, both in Turkey and globally. Gülen is above all a practitioner of tafsir, Quranic exegesis, operating within the broad discursive traditions of Sunni Islamic commentary on the Quran and the Ahadith, and an understanding of either Gülen's own intervention or the orientations and aspirations of the Gülen movement is impossible without exploring the theological underpinnings of this discursive tradition. Simultaneously, the Gülen movement is a distinctively contemporary, postmodern, I know we don't like that word, but I'm using it here, postmodern socio-political entity, cosmopolitan in both its scope and perspective, and cannot be comprehended without the analytical tools offered by critical sociology, anthropology, and political science. Nevertheless, the broad division between works on Gülen's theological arguments and ethical projects on the one hand, and the socio-political features of the Gülen movement on the other, begs a question. What are the foreclosures of analyzing these two thematic sets separately?
Or more positively, what new perspectives might an integrated analysis of Gülen's theological arguments and ethical values on the one hand, and the socio-political formations of the Gülen movement on the other, offer? To the best of my knowledge, only one work, Ali Bulach's masterful Din, Kent ve Cemaat Fethullah Gülen Örneği, has attempted such a synthetic approach. Unfortunately, Din, Kent ve Cemaat, like so much of Bulach's oeuvre, has not been translated into English. Now, I should say that all of that said, I think we've had some wonderful presentations this weekend that have attempted this synthetic approach. I'm thinking in particular of Father Michel's paper yesterday, also Margaret Rausch's, and in certain respects Klaus Grunel, John Paul this morning, Gökhan Bajik. So that's a wonderful aspect of the conference. So a brief paper such as this, is hardly the context to explore all of the issues that I've raised in depth. Nonetheless, in the time I have remaining, I would like to forward a model for just the sort of integrated investigation of the theological, ethical, and socio-political facets of the Gülen movement that I've proposed. I'll summarize some of the major themes that each aspect of this synthetic project explored at greater length. Beyond this, I will attempt to suggest how the theological principles, ethical values, and socio-political forms in question mutually inform and orient one another. Finally, I'll offer a few preliminary notes on a fourth category of inquiry and analysis with reference to the Gülen movement, on which, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been any research yet, aesthetic ideals and practices, especially those related to the ideological construction of space and place, though again, yesterday we heard a lot about space from John Paul. So as anyone who speaks at the end of a conference knows, you have the enviable duty of trying to summarize everything that's come before, even as you add your own interventions. So the first section then, theological genres of Gülen's oeuvre, tafsir, the question of ijtihad, and tasawwuf. From the perspective of theological genre, Fethullah Gülen's oeuvre is best understood as a work of tafsir, or Quranic exegesis. As such, Gülen actively participates in an esteemed and well-established Islamic discursive tradition. His argumentative style and thematic palette also draw significantly from the Risale-i-Nur, the tafsir of his predecessor and principal inspiration, Said Nursi. Gülen's theological dispensation also bears distinct relationships to two other principal currents of the Islamic tradition, fiqh, or jurisprudence, and tasawwuf, or Sufism. Although he is clearly versed in both the sources of both fiqh and the classics of tasawwuf, his writing is especially rich in metaphors mined from Sufism. Gülen, as an author, is neither a legal scholar delivering fatwas nor a sheikh addressing his disciples. On the contrary, Gülen's writings are typically modernist in that they appeal to reason, aql, as a privileged means to belief, iman. Moreover, this appeal is universal, made not only to Muslims but to all of humankind. A particularly interesting question related to Gülen's theological arguments concerns the status of his work as ijtihad, or authoritative legal interpretation. Is Gülen best understood as a contemporary mujtahid, a hermeneut operating within the legal traditions of Sunni Islam? Writers such as Ihsan Yilmaz have argued just this, but in doing so, I would argue that they obscure a crucial distinction. Within contemporary Islamic discourse, as well as discourse about Islam, there are two competing concepts of ijtihad. First, the narrow traditional definition of ijtihad as a legal procedure only available to properly trained jurists and only desirable when other means of juridical reasoning, such as qiyas, analogy, and ijma, consensus, have been exhausted. So that's the more specific legalistic definition of ijtihad. And secondly, the more general interpretation of Islamic principles and ideals in reference to contemporary dilemmas. According to the former traditional definition, Fethullah Gülen is certainly not a mujtahid. Indeed, imagining ijtihad in a strict sense outside of a political legal context in which Sharia is at least partially constitutes civil or criminal law is exceedingly difficult. However, according to the latter, more metaphorical definition of ijtihad, which emphasizes originality in interpretation of the sources of tradition, Gülen certainly might qualify as a mujtahid, as Yilmaz argues. I have a section here also dealing with the question of the mujaddid, or renewer, which we heard from Professor Findlay about yesterday, but I'm going to skip over that. Talk a little bit about tasawwuf on a theological level here. Like the status of his work as ijtihad, Gülen's debt to Sufism is complex and often the object of extreme misunderstanding. In order to grasp the relationship among Sufism, Gülen's writing and the Gülen movement, a clear delineation between theological inheritance and sociological categorization is in order. I think this is a very important point. So in this context, I vividly remember a heated discussion I had with a noted scholar of Tasawwuf, which erupted at a conference in Norway last year when he offhandedly referred to, and I quote, such modern tarikats as the Gülen group. This individual, not a scholar of Gülen or Turkey, himself made the common mistake of confusing theological heritage for sociological identity. While a strong argument can be made for the status of at least some of Gülen's oeuvre as a work in Sufi theology, the Gülen movement is in no sense a Sufi order or a tariqat, a point that I expand upon elsewhere in the paper a bit more. For the moment, I merely want to call attention to the importance of distinguishing carefully between theological and socio-political categories, especially when a single term, such as tasawwuf, often encompasses both. Okay, the next section of the paper is on moral philosophy, and here I talk particularly about the notion of musbet or musbet hareket and hizmet or service. Musbet largely means positive action, and hizmet, well, we talked a lot about hizmet, but I'm going to provide a more explicitly ethical definition here. So in order to comprehend the guiding ethical imperative of both Gülen's writing and the Gülen movement as a whole, we might consider musbet, or positive action, a concept that is particularly favored by the Noor community. And this derives from the writings of Said Nursi. I'm just going to quote him now. This is from his final epistle. Musbet hareketler, or positive actions. Wow, that's extraordinary. I knew this would happen. And yet I'm still shocked. Musbet hareketler are often contrasted quite strongly with their opposite, menfi hareketler, or selfish actions. So Nursi writes, our duty is to act positively, it is not to act negatively, it is only to serve belief in accordance with divine pleasure, it is not to meddle in God's business. We are charged with responding with patience and thanks to all the difficulties we may encounter in this positive service of belief, which results in the preservation of public order and security. So I'm going to have to perforce summarize quite a bit now. The rest of this section, I guess I'll just resort to summary at this point. The rest of this section argues very strongly that hizmet is best understood as a musbet hareket, that is, as a positive action that is not self-interested. And in some sense, that's almost a sufficient definition of hizmet. Hizmet, of course, would be oriented toward others, whereas musbet has a more general definition, but I can expand upon this in the question and answer period. I also argue that dialogue activities should be understood as specific realizations of both musbet and hizmet. Moving on, I then have a section on the institutional formations and sociological categories of the hizmet movement. And here I particularly focus on the question of whether or not Jemaat, community, or hareket, movement is a more appropriate sociological label for the Gülen movement, even though in the English translation we're using movement now. I'm going to just read a brief passage from an encounter that I had with a man who is in the audience, Erkan Bey, I believe, last summer, which demonstrates some of the key questions here. I also have a whole section on why tariqat is really inappropriate, but I think we can all agree to that already, so I'm going to skip over that. This is about the distinction between Jemaat and tariqat, or rather Jemaat and hareket, that is to say community and movement. And this is Erkan Bey from the Gazete-Ciler ve Yazarlar Vakfı, the Writers and Journalists and Writers Foundation, arguing strongly for the categorization of movement, hareket, rather than community, Jemaat. I'm quoting him now. I hope I'm not misquoting him. He'll let me know if I am. I recall that a number of us had just arrived in Kiev. It was winter, cold. We were staying with a Ukrainian Christian who had been trained in one of the Turkish schools. It was past time for Yatsı Namazı, the evening prayer, so we were looking for somewhere to pray, and this Ukrainian friend of ours opened up a small chapel in the building where we were staying so that we could perform our prayers. Now, it doesn't make sense to call this Ukrainian Catholic man a member of the community or Jemaat. He isn't even Muslim. But he speaks Turkish and was educated at a Gülen school. In some sense, he is part of the movement, hareket, even as, for that matter, are you, Jeremy. So I think this nicely summarizes some of the issues at hand here. 2 minutes, so I'm yet again with a vicious knife, just cutting things away. I have a section on aesthetic practice, which in some sense I think is the most original contribution to the paper, though I'm already published a bit of it elsewhere. Really, this focuses primarily on the incorporation of Ottoman aesthetic ideals in the places and spaces of the Gülen movement. That's not to say, to be clear, this is not a political project. It's focusing especially on things like Ebru Sanata or watercolor painting, also divan couches that we're perhaps all familiar with, where one sits at a sort of equal level with all of the other participants in the discussion. Also a sort of rendering of Istanbul as a more pious space in contrast to Kemalist ideologies of the city. So I know I have to finish. Let me just read my conclusion very quickly, if I may. Rather than rehashing the arguments and themes that I've articulated thus far, I'd like to say a few words in conclusion about the Gülen movement as an exemplar of civil Islam. Elsewhere in my research and writing, I've identified civil Islam with another concept, liberal piety. These concepts require some explanation. Liberal piety is not a description of a simple political orientation, but rather a specific type of religiosity in relation to the hegemonic secularism of the Turkish state. Similarly, civil Islam describes the Gülen movement's separation from the Turkish state and its preference for organization within the sphere of civil society, a point that I emphasize, well, in the paper, though not in my talk. With these categories in mind, we can close with two final questions. What does Turkish laicist secularism imply for the Gülen movement, and what does the Gülen movement mean for Turkish secularism? The answers to these questions are complex and occupy me throughout my research. Minimally, it is clear that the Turkish state, which was once so repressive in its relationship to Islam outside of its purview, has undergone significant transformations in the past 30 years or so, and of course James Harrington's paper nicely emphasized this point. While it is too soon to claim that Turkey has instituted a liberal American model of secularism, there are certainly reasons to believe that a movement in that direction is underway. Minimally, it is clear that the Gülen movement enjoys greater tolerance in Turkey now than it once did, however tenuous and incomplete this tolerance may be. Simultaneously, the cosmopolitan global networks that partially constitute the Gülen movement have, in some sense, succeeded in bypassing the dilemmas of Turkish secularism entirely. As for the Gülen movement's importance for Turkish secularism, I strongly believe that it cannot be underestimated. Especially in relationship to Diyanet, or the Presidency of Religious Affairs, the efflorescence of the Gülen movement as an exemplar of non-political civil Islam indicates new possibilities for the relationship between the state and religion. And as the relationship between the state and Islam in Turkey continues to shift, the theological, ethical, socio-political, and aesthetic ideals of the Gülen movement will doubtless open to new horizons of both pious and secular possibility. Thank you.